introduction of me. Because of time limit, let me just jump into my reading. Please excuse me when I skip here and there throughout my reading. The first section, performativity, semiotics, authentications, reading medieval documents. Second line, documentary historian Peter Rook asserts semiotic and extra-textual materialities must be included in any investigation of ancient and medieval documents. Influenced by Rook's medieval documentary semiotics, medieval historian Alfred Heot's works focuses on the forgeries from late medieval England. Heot argues that an authentic medieval document meets external as well as internal standards, therein appealing to mentality of contemporaries as well as to societal consciousness. Heot substantiates his claims through emphasizing the visual and the formal dimensions of documents of the era. And like Rook, he also understands the materiality and performance of such documents as a kind of semiosis by which authenticity can be read. Indeed, within the medieval period, it was a social commonplace for readers to scan for visual signs encoded into a document, a seal affixed to the text, for example. And this kind of codification took precedence over either the style of handwriting or indeed a document's content. An apocryphal example, during his papacy, Pope Innocent III was once confronted with a document that ostensibly he had composed. Based on the style of the script, the Pope himself initially doubted the authenticity of the work, but he was compelled to take the letter as authentic simply because the bulla, the papal seal, appeared genuine. However, the story does not end here. The Pope eventually proclaimed the work a forgery when it was discovered that the seal had been removed from different documents and placed on the forgery. This historical hijinks indicates the lengths to which forgery would go. The chicanery implies that should a forger wish to successfully pass off an inauthentic document as legitimate, he or she would first need to remain acutely vigilant, cognizant of the complex semiotic mechanisms operant within the creation, circulation, and reception of such documents. And the forgers could calculate in advance the visual cues. Visual cues will forge the documents would need to exercise in order to pass as authentic before the watchful eyes of intended readers. In the late 14th century, medieval English Breton lay Malory, the eponymous young female protagonist Malory, the king, the royal steward, are shown to commonly accept forged letters as authentic and thereafter act on the letter's instructions. This motif recurs throughout the text, implying that not only is no less a personage than the queen mother who choreographs the entire forging process within Malory, fully aware of the complex semiotics of documentary culture, it can also be asserted that the older queen is in all likelihood to have had a considerable foreknowledge of how to exploit documentary practices in order to bring to fruition her deceitful, politically dangerous enterprise of using forgeries to calumniate and expel the king's consort and his sole heir. And from there, I'd like to skip the rest of the section and go to the next section on page 90. The next section, manuscript context, constant saga, and topos of forgery. The dialectal configuration of Malory suggests that this short romance was probably composed around the late 14th century in Northeast Midlands or East Anglia, the Norfolk or Norwich area. British Library manuscript Cotton Caligula A2 dated between 1446 and 1460. And the single anthology wherein our poem is extant is reported to be plain, unpretentious, and practical paper manuscript that displays no marked decoration or illustration, but is only washed in red or yellow. It is also noted that among the compilation of this manuscript are included religious romances, devotional lyrics, and didactic poems, a textual constitution that is recurrently witnessed in anthologies owned by urban, wealthy merchant households in late medieval England. This manuscript context of cartoon Caligula proposes that this miscellany was produced in mid-15th century, presumably at the commission of a certain great wool merchant household of East Anglia, a province that enjoyed financial prosperity in the later medieval era through manufacturing woolen products, and that Emare appealed to the literary taste of such merchant bourgeois leadership. Emare is a late medieval reworking of the popular Constance saga, wherein the young, innocent, and beautiful noble maiden Constance undergoes a series of harrowing ordeals that newly claim a life and that of her child. Chaucer's Man of Lost Tale is another analog to this topos. By the conclusion of the text, she is of course happily reunited with her husband and other family members. This constant legend had an extensive readership from 12th to 16th centuries across a wide range of regions, languages, and genres. And because this romance is relatively unknown, let me give you a summary to the main narrative on page 91. Emare is the only child of the widowed Emperor Artius. When she has grown into a beautiful maiden, the Emperor falls in love with his own daughter, becomes even more infatuated upon seeing her wearing a robe made of mysterious cloth, and decides to marry her. Indignant Emare, who strongly denounces her father's sexual offenses as immoral, he orders her to drown into a rudderless boat. Adrift for several days, Emare arrives at Gales and is rescued by Sir Cadore, the steward of the royal household. The king of Gales falls in love with Emare, and despite his mother's strong objection, he weds Emare. Soon Emare is with child, and the king leaves the young queen under the protection of his steward as he departs for overseas battles. When Emare gives birth to a son, the steward sends a letter through a messenger to inform the king of the good tidings. When the messenger stops at the queen mother's castle on his way out to the king, the old queen, after intoxicating him to unconsciousness, steals and burns the letter, and forges a letter stating that the young queen has given birth to a monster. Despite the highly disturbing message that this forged letter conveys, the king commands in his letter that the queen and the child be well looked after. The queen mother intercepts this letter once again and forges another letter that orders the queen and her child to be cast adrift in a boat. Later, the king discovers that his mother is responsible for the counterfeit letters, which supposedly brought his wife and son to death, and banishes the old queen. Meanwhile, Emare and her son Segramore arrive in Rome and are taken in by a wealthy merchant. When Segramore reaches the age of 14, the emperor and the king visit Rome on a pilgrimage, where they are eventually united with Emare and Segramore. And I'd like to go to page 92 and the end of the continuing paragraph, 3 lines down from the top of the page. In this paper, I contend that the particular semiotic practices undertaken with the medieval modes of textual production and reception contribute to the character's mistaken acceptance of the forged letters as genuine. Certainly, they are misleading works to the logic of misapprehending the letter's visual symbols, isolated by many documentary historians as a materially important component in any medieval reading event. Let me skip the immediately following paragraph and go to the end of, 2 lines up from the bottom of that page. I'm so confused because there are so many parts I crossed off. I think I'm on the last paragraph of that page, page 92, the beginning of the last paragraph. As Elizabeth's scholar rightly observes, one particular aspect of MRA is that a considerable portion of the plot is concerned with articulating how a series of miscommunications of one kind of another embroils the protagonist in arduous plights, while characters, including MRA herself, fail to communicate truthfully, or more precisely, communicate by deception and intentional misdirection. Indeed, what lies at the heart of such failed communications are the 2 forged letters, the creation and transmission of which is engineered by the Queen Mother. As the narrative defies, the forged letter theme surfaces when the royal steward sends a letter to the king staying overseas, and declines when the king judges his mother as guilty of high treason and exiles her. And let me skip the rest of the section and go to the next section, the new section, Maud and Rote. In total, 4 letters are composed in MRA. The first letter sent by the steward to the king and the third letter sent by the king to the steward are genuine, and both are intercepted by the Queen Mother and replaced with forged letters. When the Queen MRA gives birth to a healthy prince, the loyal steward promptly writes a letter to inform his lord of the good news. The steward acts of composing and sending a letter to the king is presented in a manner of paraphrase. Let me skip the quote. This first letter, created by the steward, is in all likelihood to have followed the usual formats of an official medieval document, in that, as the deputy of the king, he sends it as a due report to the absent lord on the queen's safe delivery of an heir. In addition, the steward is equally likely to have authenticated the document either by sealing it or by attaching his seal on a tag or a tongue of the document before giving it to his messenger. Despite the author's explicit allusion of these details, the 2 verbs, Maud and Rote, which are employed to describe the composition of the steward's letter, still offer a suite of decisive clues that will lead readers closer toward ascertaining the specific ways in which the steward creates and authenticates his letter. Both Machen and written are commonly translated and right in modern English, yet in medieval period they seem to have carried a distinct nuances. According to Middle English Dictionary, the verb Machen has more than 20 meanings, the fifth being to write or compose a book, poem, song, prayer, letter, etc. On the other hand, the primary definition of the verb written is to form symbols, letters, words, etc., and write in a book, on a wall, etc., and also to carve into a stone insides. Medieval documentary historian Giles Constable holds that writing in antiquity and Middle Ages consisted of 3 steps, at least in theory: putting the ideas into words, componere, dictating them aloud to the scribe, dicere or dictare, and writing them down on the surface of parchment or letter, scribere. Although the first 2 steps were more often not merged into a single step, dictare, in reality, the last step, which primarily involved physical labor, was kept distinct from intellectual efforts of competition. Reconsidering the meanings of Machen and written within this medieval context, it can be proposed, firstly, that Machen involves all of the 3 steps of writing, from organizing ideas to inscribing them on the surface of parchment or paper. Secondly, the first definition of written indicates that the verb was typically employed describe the final step of writing, a scribal labor in which a dictated text was scripted across the surface of a wax table, parchment, or paper. If we apply this observation to the ways in which Stuart's creation of his letter is conveyed in the poem, one conclusion seems to become clear. The verb made in the given quotation indicates the Stuart's labor as integral to the composition of his letter, while the twice used verb wrote emphasizes the actual manner mode of production. If we accept wrote intends the manual labor of writing down a message, the repeated use of the verb in consecutive lines may well indicate that in place of dictating the letter to a secretary, the steward writes in person, presumably because he takes the birth announcement of Prince to be a very serious matter, demanding his personal attention. It is also worthwhile noting that while both made once and wrote twice are used in describing the steward, the letter writing, only made is employed in the case of the letters of the king and the queen mother. This distinctive use of the verbs further offers the possibility of different letter writing processes, one of which may be that while the steward acts as an author-scribe who self-produces the document manually, the royal members most likely dictate their correspondences to their secretaries, who then inscribe them onto paper. The following lines narrate the Queen Mother's interception of the authentic letters from Stuart and the King respectively, each time after ensuring that the messenger is intoxicated and unconscious. The Queen Mother steals and burns the original letter and then orders her scribe to fabricate a new letter. Let me read the translation. The first quotation: she went to the chamber, she took the letter from him, the messenger, and then she burned it in a fire. She wrote another evil letter that said that the queen had given birth to a devil. And the second quotation and translation: the evil Queen Mother examined his letter and then cast it into the fire. She had another letter written that said that man should take the queen and lead her out of town. No major difference can be marked in the contents of these two quotations. Recurrently observed, however, is that when the Queen Mother is mentioned, the verb maken is used in the form of made and make. The repeated uses of made and make imply that unlike the steward, who personally wrote his own text on paper, the Queen Mother has dictated her message to a scribe. The expressions side and left make lend a firmer credence to this reading. Especially the verb sigh suggests that the Queen Mother spoke or dictated the content of the original letter to her scribe. The phrase left make is an even stronger consolidation. According to the MED, Medieval English Dictionary, from the late 12th century on, the verb led was used as a causative verb to express that the subject impels someone to something or causes someone or something to do something. Based on this observation, one immediate elaboration led to make is that the Queen Mother is most likely to have made her secretary write a letter. Let me skip the last paragraph and go to the next section, seals and messenger in Malory. Now it seems timely to turn to the next concern of this paper, namely, which dimensions would enable the forged letters to be conceived as genuine articles. As seals became the principal means of authenticating documents, especially from the 13th century until the 15th century, the successful reception or not of many forgeries in later Middle Ages were determined by the method in which seals were represented. If a letter arrived with a seal intact, the authenticity of the letter was more or less assumed. If a letter arrived with a seal either tampered with or broken, the recipient was automatically suspicious. Denouncing the act of forgery, Pope Innocent III defined forgery in several categories, two of which were concerned with the most frequent cases in which seals were used or reused. The first case in which a false seal was attached to a genuine text. The second case in which the authentic seal was attached to a falsified text. Because the Queen Mother in Malory has thrown the steward's letter into the fire, it can be safely inferred, firstly, that her scribe had to compose a new text, and secondly, that in order for this new text to be accepted as authentic by the king, a genuine seal was saved from the original letter. We accept this speculation, and we necessarily arrive to a conclusion that the first forged letter would be forgery with a genuine seal attached to newly composed text. Indeed, the author does not elaborate the whole process of forging the first letter, nor preside over a commentary describing from where the seal for the old queen's newly produced text is acquired. Then how can we, with any certainty, argue that the first forgery arrives with a genuine seal that has been detached from the original letter and repurposed? Let's suppose the reverse case, in which the steward's letter was issued without a seal, and so was the forged letter. One scenario would be that even if the style and script of the original letter were perfectly imitated, the king would still become suspicious of the authenticity of the letter on the grounds of its shocking content, and the absence of the steward's authenticating seal would only serve to aggravate his suspicion. This exercise bolsters my contention that a seal was attached to the steward's original letter, and thereafter the old queen's scribe removed the seal from the letter and reattached it to the new text he or she fabricated. Subsequently, because he recognizes his steward's seal looks intact, the king takes the forged letter to be authentic, despite the unusually disturbing message and probably unfamiliar script and style. Unlike the forged steward's letter, it is much easier to speculate on the successful forging of the king's letter. Though he is much troubled by the news that a three-headed monster has been born into his beloved queen, the king orders the steward in his letter to take due care of his queen and newborn baby. Let me skip the quote. As happens in the description of the Queen Mother perpetrated forgeries, the verb "made" and not "wrote" is employed in presenting the king's production of his letter. The use of this particular verb indicates that the king in Malory dictates his letter to a secretary, just as his mother does. Unlike the steward case where thorough investigations are demanded as to whether he uses a seal for the sake of authenticity, it is explicitly stated that the king secures the letter with his seal. The king's closing of the letter with his seal, while on an overseas battlefield, corresponds with historical account that in addition to the great seal and privy seal, the English kings always carried an extra seal or wore a signet ring in order to authenticate urgent documents, and they also took a second great seal with that when they went abroad. Let me skip the center of the paragraph and go to the end of the paragraph, maybe 6-7 lines up from the bottom of the paragraph. Considering the properties of the seal of the king's letter, it is not hard to picture the old queen commanding a scribe to make every possible effort to maintain the intactness of the seal so that it can be reused for the forged text. The meticulous procedure to save the king's seal would be a due course following the Queen Mother's anticipation that the external condition of forged letter, and most notably the seeming authenticity of the seal, would play a decisive role in her deception, wherein paratextual signifiers of false text would cause readers to simply accept the text as genuine. The authenticity of the royal seal needs to be powerfully apparent to the recipient, considering the unusual circumstances in which the king sends his epistle while at war on foreign soil. a situation wherein no immediate confirmation of documents' validity can be available. Though the steward is so distressed with a ruthless command described in the letter that he falls into faint, neither he nor the victim himself dare question the authenticity of the letter. However, reluctantly, the steward instead executes the acts outlined as orders within the letter, and Malory too accedes to the death sentence of being cast adrift in rudderless boat with her newborn son. Here, one may well raise the question, what would cause them to be so certain of the letter's veracity despite its unusually merciless content? A logical answer can be found in the concrete materiality of the royal seal affixed to the surface of the document. The king's physical absence configures his seal with as much regal authority as the man himself. Not as prominent as the seal, yet still important, the messenger is another influential component of medieval authenticating mechanisms. At the sender's request, medieval messenger often read aloud the letter to the recipient, and he also often acted as sender's envoy, whose mission was to deliver and then read the entire message when it was too confidential to be textualized on a page. Therefore, on one hand, the medieval messenger was a functionary who authenticated the documents he delivered, but one must not forget at the same time that the messenger sometimes became lost or purloined and waylaid, or even voluntarily attempt to expose or forge the documents they were responsible for delivering. In such cases, messenger system was potentially weak link in the ethical mechanisms of medieval epistolary communication. In Malory, the Queen Mother seals the letters of steward and the king from the steals the letters of the steward and the king from the drunken messenger. The messenger himself remains blind to this fact until he is interrogated by the king. Let me skip the rest of that paragraph. One mystery that remains unsolved is why neither the king nor the steward in our poem either asks the messenger or checks the validity of the content of the letters. For example, whether the queen has indeed given birth to a three-headed monster, or how the king responds to the happy tidings of the birth of the healthy, handsome prince. If either had been done, the falsity of the letters would have been easily detected. We are left only to speculate on the credulity of the letter's recipients, or perhaps the steward hires an unfamiliar and inexperienced messenger before sending out his letter hurriedly, and the unfamiliar messenger causes the king to refrain from inquiring further of him. Within the logic of the text, these issues are never really raised or solved. Whatever the untold stories may be, the limited role played by the messenger in the poem contributes to the king and his steward being unduly swayed by the counterfeit documents. This is an additional condition that can be taken into account in calculating how the superior's letters would be endowed with such critical performativity. The messenger is meant to bridge the spatial and temporal distance that exists between the correspondence and epistolary communication. The Queen Mother certainly knows how to take advantage of this messenger system for her own purposes. Ultimately, she is momentarily successful in banishing her hated nemesis, the young queen, from the royal household, whom she considers unworthy of the royal consort. How many minutes left? Am I all time?
How many minutes do you want? A couple of minutes will be okay?
Yeah, I will try. I will try to fit into a couple of minutes. The last section is sort of my afterthought. Writing as perilous medium of communication. Illustrating the prolonged sufferings of female protagonists and her family, the English author of Malory appears to have been concerned with foregrounding the drawbacks and perils inherent in written communication. The last paragraph, the beginning of the last paragraph. Above all, it may well be noted that the forged letter fabricating the erroneous and scandalous news of the birth of dirty-headed monster in Malory has no chance of being corrected by the young mother's real story of giving birth to a healthy boy. Conversely, the latter constitutes a ruthless editing of facts to serve the interest of the forger. Let me skip almost 14 lines. The Middle English Amare perhaps conveys the poet's nostalgic glance back at the earlier era when writing existed only as supplementary assistance to memory and reality. Perhaps the medieval English author bore witness to the contemporary communicative culture where the familiar immediacy and intimacy of spoken word has been yielded to and gradually superseded by mediation and individualism of written word. Subsequently, the redactor may have felt what Harold Innis terms the necessity of recapturing the spirits of oral tradition, which is overwhelmingly significant where the subject matter is human action and feeling, especially so in literary genres that originate from oral tales such as Breton lays, to which Malory belongs to. Okay, thank you.